Welcome, everyone. On behalf of AlphaSense, thank you for joining us for this discussion. And our discussion today is AI in drug discovery and development, hype, reality, and what comes next. So this topic is really relevant right now, especially in light of recent actions taken by the FDA that indicate a growing emphasis within the agency on the use of AI in the drug development process. My name is Sarah Malott, and I'm the Director of Healthcare Research at AlphaSense, and I'll be your moderator today. All right, just for a quick note, for those who are new to AlphaSense, we are the leading AI-powered intelligence platform. We leverage the latest advancements in generative AI and smart search technology. AlphaSense surfaces critical insights from millions of trusted sources, including expert calls, SEC filings, earnings transcripts, broker and independent research, and more. So visit us at alphasense.com if you'd like more information about us. Okay, with that, I'm happy to welcome our guest, Dr. Paul Agapau. Paul is a data scientist in the biopharma industry and has many years of experience in the AI drug development arena. Paul, I'd like to turn it over to you to provide our audience with more details about your background.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So originally, I was an immunologist, but as we know, computers and software eat everything, including my career. And so for many years, I've been that person in the middle, bridging the computational and the biological worlds in there, making sure that the analysts, the artificial intelligence specialists, and others have the right sense of context for what they're doing, and making sure that the biologists and the wet lab scientists are getting the tools that they need.
Great. You're right at the intersection between these two, and that's a critical role. So thank you. You're perfect for our discussion today. Very good. Let me review the agenda. We'll start with an overview of the state of AI in drug development today and how we got here. We'll talk about how AI is delivering against expectations. We'll talk about opportunities and challenges in the space. We'll talk about the competitive landscape, and then we'll wrap it up with kind of the outlook of what might lie ahead. All right. So with that, let's dig in. Paul, I'm going to ask you to help us understand how AI is being used in the drug discovery and development today. But first, let me set the stage by sharing some data kind of frame the problems that AI seeks to address. And so here's a few things I want to point out. First, according to studies, it's estimated it takes 10 to 15 years to bring a new drug to market. Number two, the cost to do so is large. Deloitte recently reported that in 2024, the cost for a large biopharma company to develop a drug was $2.23 billion. Much of the cost issue is explained by the high rate of clinical trial failures, which is 90% according to a 2022 study. And of course, all of this is happening at the time when pressures to bring down drug costs are mounting. So with that, Paul, please tell us, how is AI being used in drug development today, and how did we get here?
Okay, so Sarah, I think your title there, hype, reality, in the future, when we're talking about the present, we're talking about the first two terms of that. There is this huge hype talk discussion about AI and the drug development sphere there, because as you've pointed out, it takes such a long time to develop drug, such a huge amount of money, so much effort, and it is very, very uncertain. And yet the drug development industry is it's a very data-centric industry, you might say. In a sense, a pharmaceutical company is an engine that consumes data and documents and produces data and documents in there. So it seems, given the success of AI and all other elements of our world, that it's a ready area for applying it there. And so there is this huge furore, fervor for applying AI everywhere and anywhere inside drug development. Having said that, there is definitely a pushback, a skepticism out there that is well earned. With all this effort that we're putting into AI, with all the money that we're spending in AI, is it actually getting us closer to our outputs there? Are we producing drugs any faster, any better than we were before? And that is a somewhat complicated answer.
Well, we're going to dig into that a little bit more. I think that's a great overview. We've got tons of data, which just generates all this enthusiasm for, yes, AI should be perfectly applicable to this space. And on the other hand, it's like, how do we actually do that? Can you Before we dig in a little bit more, can you just give us a little history of kind of how we got here? When did we really start focusing on this area, and what have we seen since then?
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the history of drug development. Back in the ancient days, which I don't know, maybe we'll call that before 1990 or something like that, to exaggerate and simplify wildly, we lent a lot on serendipity and just looking hard and in many places for drugs there. Then, with the advent of high throughput molecular technologies, sequencing, omics, things like that, we could we could take that exhaustive, that numbers-based approach and do it a lot faster. Rather than injecting something into animals, we could put something into a 98 dish tray in there and try it against different cells and so forth. So our wild and crazy search, we're able to do it a lot faster. Then around about, and it feels to me maybe somewhere in the period about 2014 to 2016, the pharmaceutical and biotech industry got AI. We had these great advances in the AI field to do with being able to build bigger and better neural nets, bigger and better AI systems in there. And that pushed over into biotech development there. And so there started being this big surge in attempting to use these approaches on the whole, how can we discover drugs better? In a sense, developing a drug is a set of long-term investments, long-term bets. So how can we make those bets just slightly better to get us there, particularly given these huge timescales in there? So given the amount of money in there, you could think even something that increases your chance of probability by a few percent is well worth investing in.
I see. My understanding is that across kind of the healthcare spectrum, the most AI funding is being funneled toward drug development discovery, um, for all the reasons you just described. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about how AI is delivering versus expectations. You talked about this earlier. I know those expectations have been running high. Let me just share a data point for you. For instance, NVIDIA made a presentation at the 2023 JP Morgan Healthcare Conference, and they cited a study estimating that by this year, 2025, more than 30% of new drugs would be discovered using AI, ramping from 0% 2 years ago at the point of that conference. So that's just one
And
example of kind of the expectations where people thought we might be today. How are we delivering against those expectations?
okay, poorly, to summarize quickly. Let me give you a more detailed answer in there. You quite aptly pulled up this, most of the AI effort is going into early discovery there. And I think this in some ways has shaped and distorted our view of the field. Now, you can and you should be looking at applying AI all across the drug development life cycle in there. But for various reasons, a lot of the attention, at least a lot of the initial attention, has zoomed in on early development there, on how can we make drug candidates, basically, and sometimes how can we make drug targets. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. Number one, it's an easy to appreciate thing. How can we make more drugs? Well, let's make more drug candidates in a
Mhm.
sense, force feeding the front end of the conveyor belt there.
Mhm.
It's an easy to conceive point in the drug life cycle. What you're doing, what you're putting in, and what you're getting out is very easy to quantify in there. And I think to its detriment, it's a somewhat constrained problem space. You don't have a lot of the messy complexities of late development there. So we've had a lot of this attention there on making these, this boosting, in a sense, the early stage of drug development. But this completely ignores that everything has to pass through the lens of late drug development, of clinical trials, of post-approval, of actually finding a set of patients to treat inside a healthcare organization. And those are much, much more complicated problems. They are much more difficult to quantify. They involve a lot of, should we say, squishy, soft human factors in
Mhm.
there. But that is where almost all of your drugs will go to die, in a sense. Most drugs will get knocked out in a clinical trial. So, in a sense, it doesn't matter what you do in early development if you still have this great attrition in late development there. But let's just put that to a side for a moment.
Okay.
So let's just say that could we have solved this first problem there, early development there? And of course, many companies with, shall we say, a big public presence and a big public face have spoken a lot about how they're using AI to accelerate drug development and so on and so forth. And this has been going for quite some years now. And yet our results so far have been that AI developed drugs have not overperformed, if you put it that way. They appear maybe to do slightly better in phase one of clinical trials, but beyond that, they appear to be regressing to the mean, if you are. So the gains are fairly modest so far. We are not looking at a revolution at this point, perhaps an evolution.
We know why the AI developed drugs have not performed much better than those that have not been developed using AI.
I don't think there's any one reason there other than, that is a very early development and late development do to a certain extent operate independently. There's a
Hmm.
bit of a cultural wall between them. Early development's very dominated by molecular and chemical issues, if you will, whereas late development is naturally dominated by the medical, by the physiological. How does this drug do in an actual real system, as opposed to cell assays or molecular assays and so forth in the laboratory? So there is a set of issues that are setting back drugs in trials, drugs in the real world that early development is not coping with, is not identifying. Now, in a way, it's unfair to lay this at the door of AI-led approaches. It's just that it's always been there, and this is being underlined by this emphasis on AI-based approaches. It is allowing us to do the slightly wrong, slightly non-optimal things faster, if you will.
I see.
Now, to their credit, there are a number of companies and people who have identified, we need to start attacking and handling these late development issues earlier. And they've done things like, can we have AI-based approaches to identify toxicology, to identify what's the chance of an adverse reaction occurring from this drug? Some of the things that, will kill the majority of drugs when they go into trials in there. But I feel, in a sense, AI has inherited the problems of early development and not completely solved them as yet.
That's a great overview. I'm wondering some of these early problems that you mentioned, like identifying toxicology problems, identifying AEs, like, is it possible to do those things with AI? Like, do we have the data to do that?
Well, that is an interesting question. I think some people certainly think we do, but I don't think we have data in such a ready form for a lot of these things. Uh, and actually, it's a good idea at this point to step out and think about the whole use of AI in biology. Now, of course, we've gotten used to AI doing amazing things for us, identifying products that we might like to buy, translating languages, navigating across cities. But there is a fundamental difference here, I think, between the type of data, the type of domains. When we're talking about sales records or traffic or sentences to be translated or whatever, we are talking there about systems that we understand very well. We
Mhm.
have a huge amount of data for them. They're well described, they're well labeled. They are human-made systems. When we are talking about biology, we're talking about a set of systems that we're still discovering. And in fact, we really only understand in a very dim, distant way in there. So we're taking a set of approaches that worked very well in well-described data spaces, and we're imposing them upon poorly described spaces that we don't understand at all, and spaces actually of a complexity far beyond anything else, and hoping that they will work the same in there. So AI in a biological system is always going to be much more challenging in there. Now, let's flip over to our toxicology and AE questions in there. So, do we have the data to make predictions about whether something will be toxic or not, whether there'll be an adverse
Mhm.
event, the results from it? And that data is there. It is not as good as it could be. Even just a couple of years ago, a lot of that data was not available in a structured sense in there. And we do need structured data in order to train AI systems. The other half of it is that a lot of those adverse events, toxicology, all of those things, they are not collected in a very rigorous, systematic way.
Hmm.
They give us a slightly biased look for the world in there. It's something like people sometimes in academic research will talk about the desk drawer problem. There's all the results that you get that are never made available to the world. And in a similar way, when you're talking about adverse events, we don't actually have a very good comprehensive, comprehensive collection data set of them in a way. So I feel we are on our way to maybe getting the necessary data. Maybe we're there, but it is still an evolving situation.
Thank you. That's a great overview. Getting that data, is it being done in any coordinated way, or is every company kind of just realizing, hey, we need this, and they're all just doing it independently in silos?
I think there's a lot of independent efforts out there.
Okay.
There is a certain amount of collection of this data by regulatory authorities like the FDA and so on and so forth, but there is certainly a lot of independent effects there. And we get back to the idea of, what data do you need to train an AI system with?
Yes.
Ideally, you need a lot of data that's sampled over the right sort of population, and you need data of all particular types. When an AE occurred, when an AE did not occur, the people that occurred in, so on and so forth. So I'm not yet convinced that we have that comprehensive data set that we would need to build those systems. But maybe early days, maybe some pre-competitive effort is needed to assemble these.
Okay, thank you. And one more kind of question in this arena. You talked about a couple of examples, like the toxicology issue, like the adverse events issue, where people are focused on trying to solve those early discovery problems to prevent drugs from falling out of the process. Are there other areas that AI simply can't address, that people don't understand in that early development process, that if addressed would result in more success? Like, is there some disconnect between what people think it can do early on and what it can't?
I think there is a general one, which is that, of course, the way that AI systems are built is they are trained upon a set of data, and
Right.
they can then make predictions upon, things like that set of data, if you will. So they are very good at operating within spaces, within sets of data that are well described, things that they know about, in a sense. They cannot make predictions about things that they don't know about it, which just seems like very bland and prosaic, but actually it is kind of a deeply fundamental problem. So you find there are these systems where, for example, you're generating new candidate drugs and you wish to have an idea of how it's going to behave, its chemical properties, and so on and so forth. And if they are drugs that are like or related to previous drugs, if they are in the same chemical space, if you
Mhm.
were, then those predictions you can make are fairly good. If you come up with anything that is actually chemically novel, you are out in a space where we have no knowledge there, so you can't make predictions. And there is also a bit of a divide there between small molecules and large molecules as well, too. Small molecules are, well, small and relatively non-complex, and we can make very good predictions there. As soon as we move up to large molecules, proteins typically, antibodies, things like that, your space that you're operating in, the number of things that can be different, that can change, the variables in there is much, much larger. And you're also moving into the biological realm there. Your molecules are going to interact inevitably with the immune system in the human body, which is I'm always reminded of that lovely quote by Ed Yong, who said that immunology is the land where logic goes to die. So lots of people are throwing themselves at this immunological end of it to try and make some sense of it, but it is just an awesomely, ridiculously complex problem.
Thank you. And of course, large molecules is where the industry is going. It's where the money is. It's where
It
the,
is.
you know, new terrain is. So
Mhm.
that's a good way of scoping out the problem. All right, we talked about a lot of challenges there. What about what is working? Where is AI working in this process? Where are you seeing the most exciting activity or returns?
Okay, so we haven't, in a sense, spoken much outside early development, which, and
Mhm.
I should say that I think there have absolutely been advances and uses within early development and so forth, but they've clouded, in a sense, I think, the things that are almost kind of boring things, if you will, in late development. Let's take, for instance, identifying patient subgroups in there. What are the characteristics that identify a group of patients? How can we cluster patients in there? Can we forecast a patient's outcome within a clinical trial based on previous history? Where do we find patients in a health system? What are those patterns of patients' distribution look
Mhm.
like? Can we even, I think there's a huge amount of use in there in using AI for what's actually fairly prosaic sort of logistics and supply problems. How can we manufacture just enough of a drug to
Mm.
satisfy needs and not waste any? How can we handle that supply equation in there so we keep them in the right places around the globe for where they're needed? So there's lots of those almost boring problems that could be solved. And finally, I did say earlier that a pharmaceutical company, in a sense, is a machine for consuming documents and producing more documents. I think the latest generative AI systems in there, the large model systems, have shown that just a superb ability at being able to understand masses of documents and being able to generate masses of documents. A prominent example is, I think it was Novo Nordisk was saying that it was employing a room full of senior scientists to produce its regulatory documents, and it would take 3 or 4 months. And they were now able to reduce that down to 2 weeks
Mm.
with the use of generative systems in there. And that is a massive win. That work is very boring, very tedious, and it is absolutely essential in order to get a drug into production. The regulatory documentation has to be correct. And people, not just Novo, but many other companies have used similar approaches to help accelerate those efforts. So, in a sense, we haven't replaced humans there, we've just augmented them. We've
Mhm.
just amplified their efforts so they can get to their end target a lot faster.
Got it. Thank you. So a real application for internal processes at these companies. In this group of boring kind of downstream applications, how much work is being done on the patient selection, the clinical trial piece of this? Are people focused on that, or have they been distracted by the application of AI in the discovery process?
I think they've absolutely been distracted in there. As I said, there is this cultural divide there between early development and late development there. And I feel as a result, clinical development has been late to the gospel of data, if you will. So clinical data systems are often very siloed. They're very there's poor governance over them. There's poor data quality. It's very slow to actually extract things from there. But the simple task of finding patient groups in there or identifying biomarkers for patient populations, things like that. Those are actually not even cutting edge AI that we need to do those. We could have done all of these quite easily a few years ago, but now we have all that technology there. So I think one of the stories over the coming years is going to be the modernization, the digitalization of clinical operations in there, allowing it to run a lot faster and a lot more efficiently. And you know, let's not mess around there. Clinical trials is what costs in the development of a drug in there. Individual drug candidates cost vanishingly little
Hmm.
individually. If you get a drug into trial and that drug fails, that stings in terms of time, in terms of money, in terms of people's efforts. So if we can make that more efficient, that is a huge win for a pharmaceutical company.
Thank you. Who's leading in that effort, or who should be? Are the crows leading in this area? Is it the biopharma companies themselves that are pushing that?
I don't think I can give a complete answer on that, but the picture is definitely evolving in there. You would argue that the pharmaceutical companies should be leading it in it because it is in their interest to save
Mhm,
money. But oftentimes, pharmaceutical companies are very slow to adapt. Big
mhm.
pharma is very conservative sometimes. So that is going to take time. The CROs are certainly very interested, but at the same time, they're feeling that tension there that a big pharma company decides to have a trial and a CRO is actually the one that has to make it happen.
Right.
So they are, I think there's two forces there. One, they're tracking and almost fighting the big pharma agenda, but at the same time, they exist entirely on margins, if you will. They profit in their efficiency in running a trial, so it is in their interest to run their efforts as efficiently as possible. So there is a push and pull there, I think, on the CRO side.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, thank you. And we kind of started moving into this area of opportunities and challenges. Are there any other areas that you would point out as large opportunities, particularly large challenges that we haven't talked about already?
Okay, so I mean, I've mentioned already about the regulatory documentation. We discovered that in detail, and I think that's a big opportunity there to make our documentation flows just a lot more efficient and a lot faster. And there's also the other half of that, not just producing documentation faster, but being able to ingest documentation faster as well. For example, I'm aware of one large big pharma that is using a generative AI approach to understand all its contracts because a big pharma, of course, has thousands and thousands and tens of
Mhm.
thousands of contracts in play at any time, and no one understands. No one has a mile higher gestalt view of its contracts. So, therefore, if they've used some generative approaches to actually understand what they have on hands there. Now, moving back to the science there, of course, you can also use this to understand scientific literature in a similar sort of way. And in fact, this is almost trivial at this point. If you're looking to understand the possible things that might interact with a molecule that might be in play in a particular disease, so on and so forth, things that not too many years ago you would have had to have done manually in a very arduous, hands-on, eyes-on scientific papers approach, much like a systematic view, for example, something like that. Now we can get maybe not a perfect answer, but a very good answer within minutes using generative AI approaches in there. I think also there's a lot of work going on in analyzing real world evidence, if you will, or real world data,
Mm.
previous trials in their observational studies. so on and so forth, electronic health records, for example. And these things are another way that possibly we can boost the efficiency of the pharmaceutical process in there. Rather than having to go out and do a trial of our own or an observational study of our own or a control arm of our own, maybe we can make a synthetic population
Mhm.
out there to understand what a drug is doing in a controlled population there. So this saves us a lot of money in there, and you know spares us perhaps from the ethical difficulties of investigating controlled populations in a clinical trial.
Thank you. What you said raised a number of questions for me. One of them is this. Okay, EHR data. Can biopharmas get their hands on it? I mean, we have all these privacy issues. Like, is that been an obstacle?
It has been an obstacle. It is still, I'm going to use that terrible word, evolving again, but I think the pandemic and the passage of time has meant that healthcare organizations are catching up with this whole idea of, you know, getting patients' data into an electronic health record and making it available for various purposes. So, you'll see, of course, there's been great successes with things like the UK Biobank and Our Future Health and Genomics England. And, there's the various commercial data sources, things like Flatiron, Optum, and so forth, which have been very useful for doing this sort of real world investigation.
Okay.
Having said that, there is a caveat there. Now, you might think that if you've got, say, for instance, 22 million health records of cancer patients in there, that you should have more than enough to do everything you want to. But when you start looking at particular small subpopulations, women over the age of 50 with ovarian cancer who have not had platinum therapy or something like that, you may suddenly find that you're reduced to four or five, for example.
Yes.
And especially when you're talking about new therapies in there, there's just not the track record, there's just not the history out there for us to find these useful comparators.
Thank you. That's a great summary. So we're just going to need to collect more and more data so that we have enough for these subpopulations. Okay. Another question about your earlier comments about some of the internal process work to manage paperwork and this kind of thing. Are there any vendors that are doing anything to address this, or is that an opportunity for third-party vendors, or is every biopharma doing this internally and you've just got homegrown efforts going on?
I think there's a bit of both in there. I think a lot of the big farmers have taken that on themselves, but there is absolutely an opportunity for third parties to take this on because you solve that problem for one pharma company, you solve it for them all in there. So it makes very little sense for them to, each big pharma, to do it individually. Nonetheless, Big Pharma often is reluctant to partner or thinks that it can solve everything in-house. So
Mhm.
you are going to see a lot of these homegrown solutions in there, I think somewhat to the detriment of the individual solutions. But perhaps there are signs that more of a more sensible or more efficient partnering relationship is coming up in there. So you can see from some of these data brokers, some of these data dealers, they're beginning to provide AI offerings in there that will encompass that along with a lot of other things in there. And it would make sense for Big Pharma to partner more or to procure more of these particular things rather than to develop everything on their lonesome.
Thank you. Can you give us some examples of who these data brokers and data dealers are? What are some names here?
Okay, so I mean, certainly IQVIA has a
Okay.
number of AI offerings in there, which is no surprise. It's a huge
Mhm.
corporation. It's covering the whole stack in there.
Mhm.
There are a number of AI consultancies, which I'm not going to name because there's several of them, and I don't want to pick out an individual one. But they also have partnering with particular CROs, for example, and so forth, and building those solutions for them because they've built it for another CRO
Mhm.
past. And you will actually notice if you watch the job listings that CROs have been a lot of CROs have been hiring AI people in the last year. Now, even having said that, they may have AI people on staff. They have nothing like the manpower they would need to execute a transformation of all of these objectives in there. So I feel there's lots of very good opportunities in there for outside consultancies and tractors to lend that effort, that augmentation, or those platforms that they could use inside these businesses.
Thank you. Speaking of like experience required to be successful in this field, when you and I talked prior to this
Mm.
webinar, we talked about maybe a dearth of people who bring the requisite kind of data science, AI background with the biology, chemistry background. Tell us a little bit more about what's happening there, and are we solving for that issue?
I think it 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 was a problem. It is still a problem. Maybe it's not going to be a problem for the future. So fundamentally, biology and engineering are different disciplines. And they're not just different disciplines in terms of knowledge, they're different disciplines in terms of culture, psychology, their approach to problems, and so forth. And so one of these figures hawked around very often is that 80% of AI proofs of concept failed to generate into a proper provides business value platform in there. And the number one reason cited by everyone is misalignment in
Hmm.
there. That the proof of concept or the problem that it's solving or the way it's put together or the assumptions behind it do not reflect the actual domain, do not reflect the actual business in there. And it's all to do with this gap between cultures that, the users are clinicians, they're epidemiologists, they're doctors, they're research nurses, so on and so forth. But a lot of these projects are being put together in the IT department, in the engineering department. And it's not a question of the IT people and the engineering people not being bright. It's a question of them not having full visibility on what the actual problem is to solve there, or understanding how things get
Right.
used in the field. And this is something that's been understood in IT for years and years and years. But yet, in the case of AI, here we are repeating this problem there. So no wonder we're having this kind of lack of translation there. Now, ideally, we would want people who could speak both languages. Some refer to them as bilingual, if you will, or they call them unicorns,
Mm-hmm.
so forth. And it is a tough ask to ask someone to have that command of biology and also a good solid command of informatics and so forth. We can't be world experts in both.
Right.
But I think the increasingly at the tertiary level, at the university level, people are able to work cross-disciplinary in these areas. So we do come out with these students, these graduates who, they may not be experts in both, but they have a good working command of both fields in there. And you can even nowadays see a number of medics clinicians who have very solid computing jobs, programming jobs in
Mm-hmm.
there. And those people are going to be critical in order for us to achieve that alignment and make sure that we actually build systems that do useful things for us.
Thank you. Okay, well, hopefully, as people recognize the demand for these unicorns, we'll attract more and more unicorns into the field. Thank you. All right, let's wrap up that kind of opportunities challenge section where we're at and move into competitive landscape.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of players in the AI drug development space. We have the big biopharma companies, of course, and then we have a host of startup kind of AI-enabled biotech. Some people call them tech bios.
Hmm.
And so could you just describe for us the roles of these different groups and then, the dynamics that are happening between them?
Okay. So, I mean, very much so, you can talk about sort of big and little in these scales as a gross section. So you have big pharma, and big pharma certainly is very interested in AI. It speaks a lot of high words about it and things like that. But big pharma as a rule, is not very agile and is not very innovative, as a rule, in there. And in a sense, this is almost deliberate. Big Pharma has outsourced the risk in innovation to
Mhm,
small biotech in
mhm,
there. So small biotech, scrappy, can move fast, can try crazy things. Most of them will fail, most of them will crash out and so forth. But those that do not are there waiting to partner with, sell to, or be acquired by Big Pharma. So I think those are your two ends of the spectrum there. And that is a dynamic, I think, that has existed for years and has just merely been exaggerated by this AI there. You will also, in that same space, you'll have people almost adjacent to that, your CROs or your vendors and so
mhm,
forth, who will occupy a middle space in the landscape there. In a sense, as is often said in a gold rush, you don't want to go mining for gold, you want to sell the shovels. And they're quite happy selling the shovels to
mhm,
all of these people. But, I think there's a lot of credit, there's a lot of value to doing those boring, maybe not boring, but those infrastructure things, those things that sometimes get waved over, get
mhm.
ignored, provided for the rest of the system there, so those people can fill their necessary roles.
Thank you. All right, so the dynamic here, we've got big pharma looking to acquire biotechs, tech bios, all as they've always done in the
Mm,
biotech world. So, but I don't feel like we've seen a lot of acquisitions of these tech bios. And are we seeing a lot of partnerships? Are the partnerships growing? Like, how's that working out right now?
you're quite right. I'm struggling to think of an acquisition at this particular moment. I mean, what we have seen is a lot of partnerships in their usual partnerships with promises.
Mhm,
We will pay up to 400 million contingent upon, so forth. And, that's a very typical old school farmer relationship in there. And we've seen a bunch of these smaller companies crash out, or they have entered a slightly ugly teenage growth spurt of having started out as an AI first company and at some point deciding that they have to be a pharma company in there and started running their trials and so forth because they need to run a credible trial. They
mm,
need to gather more evidence for an asset in order to make that asset a
mm.
worthy target of acquisition or purchase or so forth. And I think you do not have to look very far to see many examples of these in the landscape there. These companies that started out sort of perhaps a little boastfully saying that we're going to solve drug development and using just AI, and at some point finding that they had to turn into a pharma company,
Mm.
at least in the small, in order to increase their odds, increase their financial standings.
And of course, that's very expensive, as we've
Oh
talked
yeah.
about earlier. And like
Yeah.
we've got cash flow issues, I'd imagine. So you said you've had some crash and burn. That what's behind some of this crashing and burning?
Absolutely. I think, I, it's not going to be a comprehensive answer, but I mean, number one, I mean, a lot of people have, of course, found that drug development is a lot harder than they thought it was.
Mhm.
And there is an element of luck in there as well too. That it is as we said, it's a drug development is a series of long-term bets in there, and with a high degree of randomness. And a lot of these people that are going to go in smart, they're going to do everything right, and they're just not going to be lucky in there. So that's number one. Okay. Then there's number two, that when they move or decide they need to move into that clinical phase, that is, as you've pointed out, incredibly expensive in there. And, big pharma companies have been doing it for years. And so they have systems there. If you're a small company and you move into that phase, it's going to be difficult and expensive and so forth. And of course, you just have the vagaries of the market in there as well too.
Mhm.
That, there is one of those figures that says that for every 10 drugs released So even pre-AI and so forth, every 10 drugs released, only 3 will make money. And only 1 will actually become what we call a blockbuster. You know, be purchased a lot, be used on a lot of patients, make a lot of money in there. And so what we find is they could have some very creditable drugs in there, but they don't actually provide much of a bottom line because of the patient population isn't there, because of competitors, because of, you know, you just don't get the foothold in healthcare organizations in there. And you can occasionally see this in some of the more exotic therapies in there that, you know, they do provide a health benefit for patients, but when you subject it to the real politic of the healthcare world, it just doesn't take traction because patients don't want that treatment because it's long, it's inconvenient, it's expensive because it's any other.
Reimbursement.
Yeah, exactly. Reimbursement being a big figure in there. You know, the whole cell and gene landscape and
Mhm.
gene editing landscape is just very fraught to those economic issues.
Thanks. Okay, so this pivoting, the shift among these tech bios to having become biopharma companies running trials, what's the best approach here? Who succeeds in this? What things do they need to do to be most successful in that arena? Is it casting a wide net? Is it focus? Are there other elements?
Hmm. Okay, so I'll preface this by saying that if there was an obvious answer, an easy answer, or a comfortable answer, everyone would already be doing it. But
Mhm.
my own prejudices would be this, is that any company that goes in AI first is unlikely to be successful. Now, I'll qualify that is that if the company also uh, develops its biological capability, its biological understanding, it's got good wet lab people,
Mhm.
uh, then you know it is still in there with a chance. In fact, that's the best mix there, a mix of AI and wet lab biology in there. But if you try to go in and treat it solely as a data problem, I feel you've got very low odds in there. Uh, my number 2 thing of the wrong things to do would be if you spread, not if you spread too wide a net, but if your target is basically attacking all diseases in a sense, you know, that you're attacking the entire chemical space, you're attacking the entire disease space, and I feel you cannot be competent across that whole span of abilities in there.
Mhm.
So by inverse, who would I say is going to have the advantage of that? It's going to be people who have a solid biological knowledge in there, who have solid wet lab operating hand in hand with the computational angle in there. So, you know, in a sense, people who are biology first, if you will, they have a human in the loop on their computations. People who have a very focused idea of the disease or indications that they're treating in there, so they can
Mhm.
have a dominant understanding of those. And people will also have a focused computational approach as well, rather than we will do everything everywhere. I think sometimes you can tell who's not going to be successful because they're almost like an academic lab in a sense. They measure themselves by the number of publications they put out at AI conferences, so on and so
Mm.
forth. And I think that's almost an irrelevance to the development of drugs. It's a distraction in there. So I would look for people who have that hand in hand biology and AI approach in there. You know, they may say that they're AI first, but in reality, what are they? Are they a biology company? Then I would be positive.
Thank you. Um, let's see, I had a question here. Um, let's see, it just evaded me. I'm sorry. It'll probably come back, and
Okay.
if it does, I'll interject with it. But I'm wondering, how differentiated are these tech bio companies? Are there some real points of difference, or are they really kind of all the same at this point?
I feel there is a great deal of similarity in some sense. In a lot of them, there is a great number of companies that when you ask them what they're doing, they say we're going to solve drug development with AI, and that's the beginning and end of their story there. It's not a very focused story, in a sense, but you do have ones who have said who are focused on a particular things, where we're doing T cell repertoire in there. We're working with T cell engagers, something, or we're working on respiratory diseases, so on and so forth. So I think there is this slight differentiation, the focusing upon particular areas, particularly a lot of them going in for immunology in there. There is a lot of talk, of course, about platforms in there and how that platform is interesting and so on and so forth. And I think platforms are not really a differentiator in
Mhm.
there. Everyone has access to the same sort of computations and there and so forth. I don't think platforms are a differentiator. What's a differentiator is what particular disease you're targeting and how you're going about it in there.
Is data a differentiator?
That's interesting there because it comes down to an economic thing. A lot of the world's data, and indeed all the world's algorithms and everything, are basically available to everyone. So what's the differentiator of data in there? So if you have a special data set, that could be a winning play depending upon what that data is. But what would that be? It would almost inevitably have to be something that you have developed yourself. So you have
Mhm.
gone out and you have mapped out a territory, you have decided what data you need to progress in the territory, or you've made an exclusive partnership with some data source in
A
there.
health system, for instance?
For example, a patient registry, a set of academic labs or a consortium who are building a particular data set in there. That could be a differentiator.
How easy is it to do that?
Well, I think with a lot of that, that is going to be a long, slow, and somewhat unglamorous process in there. You can imagine that if you say you are building this data set yourself, then that's going to be very slow and tedious, and that is not the sort of thing that is immediately leading towards results. It's the undergrowth, the underground of data that you need to build everything upon, the data
Mhm.
foundations, but being very critical in there. And then, can you get access to an exclusive data source in there? Well, I think everyone would like to, but there's a limited number of people in the world there or data sources in the world there. Perhaps, I'll say. I think an area of possible opportunity there, it is well known that all of our data sources are dominated by essentially Caucasian
Yeah.
Europeans, essentially. What is it? If you look at genetic data, if you talk about the United States, Europe, they account for 86% or something
Mhm.
like that. It could be even higher. And in fact, the vast majority of it comes from the US, the UK, and Iceland in there.
Mhm.
It is well established that if you look at other ethnic groups, if you look at diverse data sources, you start to find things that you wouldn't have noticed in a monolithic data source.
Mhm.
Diverse data source actually has information in it, okay, from the diversity there. So if you were to go out there and make a partnership with, for example, hospitals in Korea who have very good electronic health records in there, or China, for example, or let's say India has a huge population in there. You know, if you were to do that, that could be a potential winning move.
Thank you. Very interesting. Okay. I thought of the question that evaded me
Okay.
earlier. Talked about focused efforts in AI drug development. And I'm wondering if there's a recognition that there needs to be more of that focus, and that's what might be explaining some of these AI drug candidates falling out of the pipeline. I think Recursion talked about in their last earnings that they had pulled a few candidates out of the pipeline. Is this a recognition that there needs to be more focused, or is that a symptom of something else?
Okay, well, I mean, I'm not going to speak for Recursion. I mean, that
Right.
event looms large, of course, in recent history there, but it's a very familiar thing there. An AI first company at some point deciding to winnow down its assets or concentrate it on things and so forth. In a sense, let's go with the things that are the safest bets
Mhm.
in there. So I think there is probably in that dynamic is there that it's AI used incorrectly could almost generate you a lot of cheap assets. You know, it could generate you a lot of mediocre bets.
Mm.
How do you find the good bets in there? And, this is not a question that has been ignored, that people are oblivious to or so forth. But it is a very easy one to forget. Don't get me a solution, get me a good solution in there. So perhaps that is being reflected upon this phenomena there of these AI first companies at some point saying, we need to concentrate and focus. Let's knuckle down on these particular ones in there. There is also, I might say, another dynamic in there, which is a little bit to do with the economic system as well, too. Um, in good times, in rich times, big pharma and investors and so on and so forth will be far more tolerant of innovative work, will be far more tolerant of risky work because there's a lot of money around in the system. They're not worried in constrained times and risky times like our own, people's
Mhm.
appetite for risk has been much decreased in
Yeah.
there. So a lot of the usual people who would pay for these things are reluctant to invest, they're reluctant to buy, things like that. And so therefore, you will see a lot of these companies, these smaller companies they're unable to find buyers for some of their more innovative drugs there, or they don't see a future for them, or
Mhm.
they themselves feel that they have to focus in on the safer bets, the somewhat more conservative ones.
Got it. Thanks. So do you anticipate a lot of consolidation kind of within this group? How do you see that playing out?
My feeling is that we're going to have a little bit of uh, the tire meets the road moments of the
Mhm.
next 12 months in there. There are a lot of companies who got very good investment, had a lot of money coming to them, 3 years ago, say, for
Mhm.
example, and that money is going to start tapping out in there,
Mhm.
unless there is a sudden turnaround in market conditions in there.
Mhm.
Okay, but will be very difficult for a lot of those companies to continue if they cannot find increased funding in there, and there is going to be this demand for the promise of AI to translate into the delivery in there. And I think you can see this dynamic happening already, that there are various AI first companies or AI divisions in bigger companies that have spoken a very boosterish, a very optimistic game for many years, and now are suddenly finding that they're having to actually deliver upon something in there, which they are attempting to do to various degrees.
What advice would you give these companies? I mean, do they have some assets they could sell off? Or do they crash and burn completely? Do they pivot to something else if they can't get that development going, like you described, of some candidates?
Odd. That is a good question, and I'm not sure there's any one answer to be given
Mhm.
there. Because in some of them, they have a very short runway in there. They have to get
Right.
money from somewhere. So, as terrible as these cutbacks and consolidations and things are, I think they are the only solid moves that can be made at the moment if you can't get more money. There are a couple of companies I know that have, they've gone to the wall with very promising assets that now are not going to go anywhere. And that obviously doesn't do anyone any good. You
Right.
have to keep alive to keep this running. I feel the industry as a whole could do much more with partnerships in there. We could do with fewer rugged individualists and more partnerships in there with companies combining approaches, combining assets, lending expertise, the big companies partnering with small companies in there to spread out some of the risk and to share some of that knowledge and expertise. I think also along those lines, we could do with a lot more of sharing of knowledge and standardization of approaches. For example, there are particular areas in drug development where 100 different companies, 100 different laboratories have had a go at it, and they've done it 100 different ways. And yet we are no better off understanding which is better than the other because they haven't done it in any comparative way. They haven't shared benchmarks. They haven't done any of these things. Neoantigen identification and discovery is like that. It's very difficult to know what works because everyone does stuff just slightly differently in there. If we were going to look at a successful counterexample, we'd look at something like AlphaFold, where AlphaFold came out of a shared protein structure prediction competition that had been running for years, and that that catalyzed that creation in there. This kind of this amazing piece of software, and we were able to see that it actually worked and how much better it worked than anything else. But that's perhaps a bit of idealism on my part, the ex-academic.
Thank you. Are you seeing signs of movement towards more of these partnerships that you described?
I
This is
feel
just
on the
hope.
yeah, I feel on the government level, maybe. There's certainly here in Europe, there has always been this long tradition of things like the Horizon projects and so on and so forth, that where the governor's made some determination of we need companies to get together and work on this particular problem. You're going to be working on Alzheimer's, you're going to be working on prostate cancer, and you're going to share data and approaches and see where you get there. And you can see some of these shared infrastructures in there with people sharing information about drug structure, for example, or they're sharing information on real world populations and so forth, and things like the OMOP Odyssey projects. Uh, those things, from our experience, they are quite expensive, but they pay back just so many more times over when those projects actually realize in their benefit for everyone in the
Mm,
world, that everyone who puts into them gets something much bigger back in return.
Thank you. Okay, a couple more questions before we move into our outlook section. That's this. When you describe companies that you think are kind of taking the right approach to this AI drug development space, are there some under the radar names that you would point to that you think are doing it right?
Okay, so one should not take this as an exclusive survey of the field or
Yes.
anything like that. But I think companies that illustrate a sensible approach are ones like, say, eTherapeutics or Lab Genius, and they're both of them based here in London. I mean, eTherapeutics has got a very focused, it's a small company. It's very focused on interference RNA therapies in the context of the liver, I think. So, they've got a very restricted domain in there. They've got wet lab scientists, they've got computational scientists, they all work together,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel that has a greater chance of being successful than trying to solve the entire world of disease with purely computational approaches. Similarly impressed by Lab Genius, who are working with T-cell engagers in there, and they have a very rigorous back and forth between their wet lab people and their computational people, where the wet lab people are providing data for the computational people to make predictions, which are fed back to the wet lab people to prove them, or, disprove them, and, a virtuous cycle, if you will, in there.
Thank you. That's helpful. All right. Anything before we move on, anything that's surprising you about what's happening in the competitive arena right now?
Oh, surprising me. Well, I mean, I was surprised by the whole large model sort of generative AI thing, which just seems so ridiculous, but I think is actually turning out to have, solid applications there. It's not going to fix all of the world's problems, but I think it's going to become a standard part of everyone's toolkit in
Mhm.
there. So there is that. Hmm. I mean, apart from that, and maybe it's not a surprise, maybe it's a bit more of a prediction of the future. So I think causal reasoning is going to be the next big thing in there. Uh, the world of biology is full of things that are accidentally associated with each other, where one thing is, another thing is also found, but they are not actually connected in there. So there's one classic example, which is that women who have HRT tend to have fewer heart attacks, but that's not because HRT affects your chance of having a cardiac incident. It's because women have HRT on whole tend to be healthier and take better care of themselves. But, and that's a very simple example. Once we blow up to the whole world of biology, we've got a lot of these very accidental associations in there. And I feel there are probably many things we know that we don't actually know because of these accidental associations. Technology for causal reasoning has advanced remarkably fast in the last couple of years, where it's allowing us to rigorously connect things together and say, this causes this does not cause this, so forth. And I think that is going to be vital for a better understanding of biology, and more specifically, it's going to be vital for helping us to understand the results of clinical trials and real world populations.
Thank you. Well, that's a perfect segue into Outlook. So
Yeah.
causal reasoning, next big area. Thank you. That was a great explanation. Who's leading in that, or should be? Is it everyone have a responsibility, or is it again kind of led by, well, the big players or the small players?
I think that particular one at the moment, real causal reasoning, that is still trapped in the university, as it were. That is
Yeah.
still trapped in the hand of individual practitioners in there. And we're waiting for that to become part of our standard toolkits. But it's happening awfully fast, I think. We're getting those software libraries out there. We're getting those things that are going to help us use it in a routine way, if you will. What other things would our outlook in the future? I think the quality of our computation and analytics has to and will increase remarkably over the next couple of years. Uh, because in a lot of cases we've been relying upon strange individuals or unicorns or people like that to do these analyses, to build these AI systems, to help us understand or put together these things that we need and so forth. The quality has often not actually been there, as in results that have not been reproducible, things we don't quite understand why they're working, and so on and so forth. But with an improvement in the education, with the emergence of more of these people who astride the two fields, with
Mhm.
an understanding of DevOps and ML ops, as it's called,
Mhm.
I think we're being able to move it from that slightly maverick university quality field to moving it more into business as usual in there. And that's not just making it easier to use, that's also giving us more confidence in the results in there. So there's going to be fewer of these incidences where something promises a great solution, but when we take it apart, when we dissect it, when we try to run it further, those promises evaporate because it was an accident, because it was done wrong, because we didn't quite understand how it was working.
Got it. And so time and knowledge and
Yeah.
iteration is going to take care of this issue. So I'm hearing you say.
A professionalization, a commoditization.
Okay, thank you. All right, so if you were to look in your crystal ball, when do you think we see kind of, I don't know the right way to word this, meaningful progress from AI in drug development? Is it a step change, or what do things look like 5 years from now? You can answer that any way you want.
Okay. We're not going to have a revolution. I think, the revolution is what was promised. The revolution is what attracted investors some years ago. The
Mhm.
revolution is a very attractive and romantic idea. What's going to happen, I think, is that AI is going to maybe not almost disappear, but it's going to merge with our usual set of tools in there. It's going to provide maybe modest but significant market improvements in efficiency across all of the life cycle in there. So perhaps once we get through this slight mini AI winter, this slight season of disillusionment, eh, it will come back if it has ever gone away, and it will become part of that toolkit. So I would say 3 years' time,
Mhm.
so forth, AI will just be there, and maybe we won't even be commenting upon it. It will just be another tool that we're using.
So we won't be saying, hey, look at these drugs that were kind of AI first developed versus these. We'll just presumably see some of these problems solved. It's costing less money, it's taking less time, we're having higher success rates, and AI is just a part of that.
Exactly. I think the whole idea of an AI designed drug, I think, is a canard. It's a huge distraction in there. Because number one, what does it mean? Are we seriously trying to say that AI will do the entire development of a drug all the way from, initial targets, candidates, running the trials up to preparing the regulatory submission? Well, that's never going to happen in there. So taking part in that fantasy, indulging with that, is just distracting us. AI becoming an assistant, an adjunct, an accelerator at all different parts of the life cycle, absolutely in there. So we're not talking about this AI is going to slash development time. That is not going to happen at this stage, not in the near future in there. But will it shave time off? Will it make it more efficient? Will it tilt the odds in our way? Absolutely. So I think there's a lot to be said for that. I think it was Andrew Hopkins of Exscientia who said, you know, drug hunters won't be replaced by AI, but drug hunters who use AI will replace the previous generation of drug hunters. And that is a picture of the future. We are going to use it.
Thank you. That's a great summary. And then finally, if you had millions to invest in this space, where would you put your money?
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Okay. If I had millions, it is
Or billions.
It is not a sure bet or anything like that, but I would absolutely go for something with an immunological angle in there. I would go for some of the less glamorous diseases, the ones, however, with a huge spread in there. Well, let me explain those two questions. We know, of course, absolutely that immunology has this huge effect on the way that people will metabolize drugs, relate to drugs, adverse events, everything like that. So if we can gain even a little better understanding with that, we can massively advance the therapies we have.
Mm.
The second is, of course, that we develop therapies often for, I wouldn't say all sorts of bad reasons, but sometimes our efforts are somewhat misdirected by the clinical need in there.
Mhm.
And it seems to me that if you could identify that there is a large population of people who are poorly served by current therapies, that will be a place where you can make a real impact in there. And I will even go as far as to say that I think there are things like COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder,
Mhm.
Okay, that would be a good candidate for that because it's the second most prevalent respiratory disease in the world, and current therapies are in fact fairly mediocre. If you got a good treatment for that, that could make a very huge impact on a vast patient population in there. And so don't let yourself be distracted by producing the next anti-cancer drug, although that's a good thing as well too.
Mhm.
But there are other opportunities out there as well.
Really, what I'm hearing you saying, you're really answering that question as you would if you were just asked about traditional development, not even necessarily AI,
I
based
think
development.
actually, yeah, I mean, we've been developing drugs for an awful long time. We know an
Mhm.
awful lot of things about disease in there. I think it's great hubris to kind of think that AI doesn't change disease. Okay. It only helps us get there faster or check our results or augment our abilities in there. The questions are still the same. What are people suffering from? How can we alleviate it? So how do we get there faster? And I think that's the baseline.
Thank you. All right. Anything important that we missed?
No, I think we've covered just about everything.
Excellent. And then finally, I always think it's helpful if you could just leave our audience with some closing remarks. This could be just a summary of kind of the most important things you would like to leave people with, or maybe questions they should be thinking about in the future. But what closing remarks do you have for our audience?
Okay. So in our great big crazy world of 2025 in there, we have, of course, the AI hypers and the AI skeptics in there. And it can sometimes feel that you're being required to join one side or another. You do absolutely not. Okay. Both sides can be wrong to some degrees. AI can be useful in there. So take that as a say. Number two, I think there's a lot to be said for commoditization of technologies. Now, that sometimes feels a little bit boring. It's a
Mhm.
bit anti-innovative in there. But if you've got something that you understand how it works and how you can trust it and you can affect not think about it, I think that's a very valuable thing. And maybe that's what we've got to ask more of our AI solutions to do in there. Number three, as I vouched for earlier, uh, biology and AI working in hand to hand are the power combination in there. You cannot treat biology as just a data problem in there. Context is everything. And if you were to try to solve everything in a purely biological way, well, that will be very slow. So why don't you use AI to accelerate it in there? And I guess my final and fourth point would be there's a lot of boring background, perhaps prosaic things that if you're looking to provide great benefit to the world, great use to everyone else, if you could solve those problems in there, you would be actually doing a great thing. And those can sometimes be very non-competitive spaces, and they
Mhm.
might even be relatively easier problems, but no one is looking at them. So perhaps there are a lot of opportunities there.
Thank you. I have to ask, were there any opportunities, these boring, prosaic opportunities that you didn't talk about earlier that you would just want to leave the audience with?
I think I'll leave that for, but I think seriously, building the tools for people is absolutely there. Rather than everyone rolling their own AI systems, everyone doing it themselves, you know, I think there is great space for building those building blocks, those tools that will do maybe those one or two important or useful things in there, and they can just become things that people use and they trust in there. One of these analogies that I often make to people is I say that when I get on a bus, I don't check the brand of the tires and I don't demand to see the license of the driver because I just expect that that
Mhm.
bus will work. In a similar way, I would love more AI tools that just work. I trust them in there. And I think trust is a very important word to think about in these situations.
Thank you. All right. Paul, thank you so much for your time today. This is a very edifying and interesting conversation. And audience, I would like to thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you found it as helpful as I did. Thank you again on behalf of AlphaSense.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. Now, Paul,